Hey there, it's Shannon Ballard, the creator and host of Southern Mysteries. This show is made possible by the core support of patrons who appreciate stories like the one you'll hear today. That's why I take the time to thank patrons who support this independent podcast through Patreon. I want to say a special thanks to our newest members, Dave Dembski from Pelham, Alabama, Kim Culpepper from Covington, Georgia, Jason McCarroll from Waurika, Oklahoma, Rockin' Rose from Mary Esther, Florida, Sarah Hess from Urbana, Ohio, Kim Leckie from Mesa, Arizona, Gwendolyn Eishaker from Ashburn, Virginia, Amber Quisted from Brentwood, California, Kate Upton from Navarre, Florida, Miranda Hargis from Warren, Arkansas, Sarah Rickert from Lake Charles, Louisiana, and Allison Kelly from Piedmont, South Carolina. And a warm welcome to new patrons who are supporting from mysterious locations: Jenna McGilvery, Josette, Reba Talbot, Jules, Frederick W., Katie Garcia, and Jean Laflamme. Now, if you're new here and you want to join these wonderful supporters in helping me create Southern Mysteries, you'll receive access to the first 3 seasons of the podcast, which are available exclusively on Patreon. Additionally, you can choose a level that grants you access to even more stories, including my monthly patron podcast, Audacious, which focuses on some of the most shocking and scandalous cases in American history. Your support helps cover the expense of producing the podcast, including research materials, website upkeep, hosting fees, and more. As a thank you, you'll enjoy ad-free episodes and exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. You can join Southern Mysteries on Patreon and get immediate access to listen to more stories now at patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. Or if you already have the Patreon app, just open it up and search for Southern Mysteries Podcast. While Abraham Lincoln led the Union in its fight to preserve the nation, some of his relatives took the opposing side. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, came from a large Kentucky family. When the Civil War began, nearly half of her siblings chose to support the Confederacy. This created doubts about Mary Todd's loyalty to the Union, and several of Mary's siblings who were living in Alabama during the Civil War caused controversy for President Lincoln. The complicated family dynamics between the Todds and the president highlighted the reality of a divided America during the war. Welcome to Southern Mysteries, exploring Southern history and true crime. I'm your host, Shannon Ballard. This is episode 160, Lincoln's Rebel Relatives. Americans feared the Civil War long before it started, but many Americans were shocked when Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 election and rising secession sentiments led to armed confrontation, the all-out war everyone dreaded. This conflict affected nearly all Americans, regardless of race or socioeconomic status. The Civil War transformed lives across the nation. That division was reflected in the war's description by the Union and Confederacy. Lincoln's government called it the War for the Union, or Civil War, while Confederates called it the Second American Revolution, War for Southern Independence, or the War of Northern Aggression. But for most Americans, the Civil War was the Brothers' War due to the deep division it caused within families and communities as they were torn apart by their beliefs and values. According to the Civil War Trust, around 3 million men fought in the war, 2 million for the Union and about 1 million for the Confederacy. An estimated 620,000 Americans died during the conflict. Millions more found themselves in complex situations. The Campbell brothers, James and Alexander, were born in Scotland and moved to America in the 1850s. James settled in Charleston, South Carolina, and would join the Confederate Army, while Alexander moved to New York and enlisted in the Union Army. In June 1862, as Alexander's regiment arrived in Charleston, the brothers unknowingly fought against each other at the Battle of Secessionville. Alexander proudly carried the U.S. flag, while James defended his position as a Confederate lieutenant. After the battle, James wrote to Alexander expressing his hope they wouldn't meet as enemies again. Alexander was later wounded during the Second Battle of Manassas, but ultimately resigned from the Union Army in May 1863 due to injuries he sustained during battle. James continued to fight until he was captured during the attack on Battery Wagner. After the war, James managed a plantation in South Carolina, while Alexander started a business in Connecticut. They stayed in touch and remained close for the remainder of their lives. They didn't allow the war to break their family bond. Many brothers like James and Alexander were pitted against each other on the battlefield, and countless families felt tension on the home front as their loved ones chose a side. Union Army General Ulysses S. Grant was married to Julia Dent, a Southerner with a prominent Southern Democrat father. Meanwhile, Laura Arnold, sister of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, was an outspoken Unionist who cared for sick and injured Union soldiers in West Virginia. Laura Arnold was one of millions of wives, sisters, and daughters left to care for the home front. Even within the White House, Abraham Lincoln and his Southern wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, knew how it felt to be divided during the war, with their familial connections with the Todds all but destroyed by the end of it. Abraham Lincoln was born into poverty in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1809, but by 1816, the Lincolns moved to non-slave-holding Indiana, which had just been admitted to the Union. Mary Todd Lincoln was also born in Kentucky. Kentucky was situated between 3 slave states and 3 free states. Historians have noted that the state connected by railroad arteries into Tennessee and Ohio, and bounded by rivers accessing the Deep South and the East Coast, made Kentucky a unique state where North and South converged. Once Southern states began to secede, Kentucky became a state torn between loyalty to bordering slave states and its desire for national union. Kentuckians were ideologically and economically torn when it came to slavery. The state's South and West sections were majority proponents of slavery, while those in the North and East were moving away from slavery. There were also Kentuckians who remained ambivalent throughout the war. The Todds were a complicated Kentucky family. Although Robert Todd morally opposed slavery, the wealthy banker owned slaves. Mary's father was a widower with 6 children when he met and married Betsy Humphreys. Within 15 years, Betsy gave birth to 8 children. The Todd house on Main Street in downtown Lexington was the family home of the future wife of the 16th president of the United States. In 1839, Mary Todd moved to Springfield, Illinois, to live with one of her sisters, Elizabeth. Mary was considered quite a catch. She was courted by several men who were drawn to her strong sense of self and her quick wit. Mary had strong opinions, especially when it came to politics, and she never shied away from voicing those opinions. When 23-year-old Mary Todd met 33-year-old Abraham Lincoln, it was, in part, their mutual interest in politics that drew Mary to the circuit lawyer. When they married at Elizabeth's home on November 4th, 1842, Mary Todd exchanged a privileged life of ease for a simpler life with the man she loved. While Lincoln pursued his career as a lawyer, Mary supervised their Springfield house and cared for their 4 sons with the help of a hired servant and a relative. Mary faithfully supported her husband politically and socially, and continued to do so when he was elected president in 1860. When the Civil War began, her loyalty was questioned because of her family connections. Gossip ran wild in Washington, D.C., that no woman born in the South could be loyal to the Union and her husband, and those rumors persisted throughout the war. The Todds were a family divided, with members of Mary's family present at Lincoln's inauguration and at the inauguration of the Confederacy's Jefferson Davis. 6 of the Todd siblings supported the Union, and 8 supported the Confederacy through marriage or military service. This division within the Todd family was especially difficult for Abraham Lincoln, who had sustained more contact with his wife's family than with his own for most of his adult life. Historian Stephen Barry described Lincoln's relationship with the Todds in his detailed study of the family, arguing that the president was a Todd more than a Lincoln, as his life was awash in a sea of Todds. He married a Todd, confided in Todds, benefited from Todds, and benefited Todds in return. Barry argues that Lincoln's deep connection with his wife's family means one cannot understand Lincoln's personal, professional, and political lives without understanding his relationship to the Todd family. That complicated relationship was emblematic of the war, and Lincoln's attempt to keep the Todds together mirrored the president's larger struggle to keep the nation together. Mary Todd Lincoln's family was large, tumultuous, and the topic of many scandals throughout the war. Lincoln's rebel relatives, as the press referred to them, were often featured in the news, including 2 of Mary's sisters who resided in Selma, Alabama. Selma is located in Dallas County, which was established in 1818 as part of the territorial legislature of Alabama. Construction of a city in the county began later that year, and by 1820, Selma was incorporated into the state. Situated along the banks of the Alabama River and just 50 miles from Montgomery, Selma was mainly an agricultural district with a booming cotton industry. Due to its prime location along the river and access to railroads, Selma became an integral part of the Confederacy. The city became a military depot during the war, and by 1863, it's estimated 10,000 people would be employed to work at production factories constructed for the war effort. 4 gunboats, the Tennessee, Selma, Morgan, and Gaines, were built in Selma to support the war effort, and a 4-mile wall was constructed to protect the city. Following the inauguration of Jefferson Davis as the President of the Confederacy in Montgomery in February 1861, 2 women who attended his reception created quite a stir. Elliday Todd and Martha Todd White were the stepsisters of Mary Todd Lincoln and sisters-in-laws of President Lincoln. Their appearance at Jefferson Davis's celebration sent a clear, shocking, and controversial message of their loyalty to the Confederacy. Martha Todd moved to Selma at the age of 19, following her marriage to physician Clement White. During Elliday Todd's visit to Selma in 1861, the 21-year-old made the surprising announcement she was engaged to 32-year-old Nathaniel Dawson. Between April 1861 and April 1862, the couple wrote more than 200,000 words to each other while Dawson was away from home fighting for the Confederacy. In a letter to Dawson, penned by Elliday on May 9, 1861, his fiancée described her family's expectations of her and her determination to live the life she desired. Elliday wrote, "Ever since I can remember, I have been looked upon and called the old maid of the family, and mother seemed to think I was to be depended on to take care of her when all the rest of her handsomer daughters left her. And I really believe they all think I am committing a sin to give a thought to any other man than the arrangements they have made for me. But as this is the age when secession, freedom, and rights are asserted, I'm claiming mine, and do not doubt but I shall succeed in obtaining them, and I have someone to help me in my efforts." News of Elliday's engagement shocked the Todds, but her fiancé was a prominent and well-respected Alabamian. Nathaniel Dawson was born into a wealthy merchant family in Charleston, South Carolina. In 1842, Nathaniel moved from Charleston to Dallas County, Alabama. He studied law in Mobile and began his legal career in Cahaba in 1851. At this time, the town of Cahaba was a center of wealth and refinement. It had at one time been the capital of the state, and many prominent Alabamians who shaped the state's history had lived there. Nathaniel Dawson was twice married before he met Elliday Todd. Following the death of his second wife, he moved to Selma, where he continued his legal practice. He lived in a home near Martha Todd White and became friends with Martha and her husband, Clement. It was that friendship which led to an introduction to Elliday. The pair began a secret courtship and within weeks had announced their engagement. Believing the conflict would be quickly resolved, the couple agreed Elliday would remain in Selma and they would marry when Dawson's military service ended or when the war ended. Nathaniel Dawson was the captain of one of Selma's Confederate companies. In addition to ammunition and supplies, more than 600 men from Selma served in the Confederate Army, with the men organized into 5 companies. Nathaniel captained the Magnolia Cadets, which was the first company to leave Selma to fight in the war. 2 of Selma's companies, the Selma Blues and Magnolia Cadets, would become an important part of Martha and Elliday's homefront experience in Selma. Both sisters, with their staunch support of the Confederacy, caused national scandal and embarrassment for the White House, while the sisters' connection with the Lincolns in the White House divided the city of Selma. Martha's husband, Clement White, was a Confederate sympathizer. He joined Confederate forces around the same time as Nathaniel Dawson, but White was away only a few months before he was forced to return home due to weak physical health. When both of their husbands were away, Martha and Elliday grew closer and defended each other when their loyalty to the Confederacy was questioned. Rumors swirled that both the Todd sisters were spying and reporting back to their brother-in-law in the White House to help the Union. When the sisters responded, defended their loyalty to the South, they were criticized for being so outspoken and trying to stir up scandal. Their next attempt to show loyalty to the Confederacy would become an embarrassment for President Lincoln. Nathaniel Dawson's Magnolia Cadets had been the first company from Selma to volunteer to fight for the Confederacy. When the company departed Selma in the spring of 1861, they carried a flag for the cadets Elliday and Martha made. The cadets departed for Dalton, Georgia, where they were to be formed with other companies into a regiment. When they arrived in Dalton, the flag received a lot of attention because the flagstaff was broken and there was great care taken to repair it. As it was being repaired, Nathaniel Dawson proudly remarked in front of a crowd that the flag had been created by 2 ladies related to the hostess of the White House. Southern papers noted that detail, which made its way to a disappointed and embarrassed President Lincoln. The Magnolia Cadets were designated the 4th Alabama Infantry at Dalton before they were sent with their regiment to Virginia. Back home in Selma, a homefront competition between support of the Magnolia Cadets and the independent Selma Blues began to rule Elliday and Martha's social life. Elliday was engaged to Nathaniel Dawson, who had been the Blues' first captain before being elected as captain of the Magnolia Cadets. When the cadets and their fellow company, the Governor's Guards, left Selma to join in the fight in April 1861, Elliday became frustrated by the attention the Selma Blues received at home. In her letters to Nathaniel, Elliday wrote of the Selma Blues taking advantage of being at home while other companies were seeing action. Elliday wrote, "The Blues are making more music and commotion about going to the war than when you left. The church bell rings 2 or 3 times a day to call the ladies together concerning the making up of 110 uniforms for this chivalrous corps." Nathaniel responded saying, "The ladies of Selma had better bestow their favors upon the guards and cadets. more than the Blues. As some women hosted gatherings for the Selma Blues, there was a growing sense of jealousy among the wives and loved ones of the Selma companies that had already left the city. When the Selma Blues left for Richmond in May 1861, an even greater conflict emerged on the home front. Most of the women of Selma were doing their part for the war effort, sewing clothes and gathering supplies to send to Selma's soldiers. However, organizing and providing supplies to 5 companies became harder with each passing month. The cadets and guards had Elliday and many other women supporting them by sending for supplies to sew clothes, which would then be shipped to them. But Elliday became frustrated when supplies didn't arrive, and she learned some of them had been rerouted to assist the Selma Blues. Eventually, Elliday and her fellow cadet supporter, Martha, played into Selma's love of concerts and organized a show to raise money for supplies. Martha managed the successful show, which raised more than $150 to purchase materials to sew uniforms and socks for their soldiers. The decision to pursue concerts and stage performances to raise money for supplies would stir up more trouble for Elliday and Martha. On Christmas Eve 1861, just 1 week before a New Year's performance, the sisters were given a program that detailed the plan for a portion of the evening that would personally insult Abraham Lincoln. This portion was planned by a supporter of the Selma Blues as a way to attack Martha and Elliday, who supported the Magnolia Cadets. The plan was considered a personal insult to the Todd sisters, who were also offended on behalf of their brother-in-law, who they were said to have despised politically but loved personally. Elliday wrote to Nathaniel saying this about the insult, which she considered to be a personal attack on the Lincolns and the Todds. What have we ever done to deserve this attempt to personally insult and wound our feelings in so public a manner? We have suffered what they never have, and perhaps never will in severing ties of blood. I thought when my visitors would come and would wish Mr. Lincoln be caught and hung, that was enough, but I feel I can never feel kindly again towards those who take part in this. Martha and Elliday were criticized for not being supportive enough of the Confederacy, and they were criticized when they openly supported the family they tried to love despite their conflict. No matter the political affiliation, they believed family should be loved and respected. But Martha and Elliday were related to the president, who was hated in the South. It's clear in Elliday's letters to Nathaniel that she believed family could talk about family, but outsiders weren't allowed to do that. One of her letters stated Elliday's political view that Lincoln was a tyrant who sought too much power over the country. When writing about the other members of the Todd family who supported the Union and were on the battlefield fighting against their Confederate family, Elliday wrote of her worry for her relatives, telling Nathaniel, "I wish the relations I have in Mr. L's service uncaught and unharmed by the Confederates." Mary and Abraham Lincoln were equally heartbroken by the family division and the sorrow of loss felt by many within their family during the war. President Lincoln showed great kindness to Mary's sister, Emily Todd Helm, after Emily's husband died, a decision which caused a national scandal. Emily's husband, Benjamin Helm, was a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. While he was away fighting, Emily had gone to Selma to stay with her sisters. After Benjamin was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga, Emily found herself longing to return to Kentucky to grieve and be with her mother. Kentucky was a border state, which meant Emily would be required to take an oath of allegiance to the United States before she entered the state. Out of loyalty to her husband and her loyalty to the Confederacy, Emily refused to take the oath. President Lincoln knew his wife was in pain, having lost 3 brothers during the war, and he knew Emily needed support from her family as she grieved. In an effort to help Emily and his wife, the president sent a message to Union authorities stationed in Kentucky. He requested Emily be escorted to the White House. Martha accompanied her sister Emily to Washington, D.C. in December 1863. The president and Mary Lincoln opened their home to Emily and Martha, who were considered enemies of the Union. The president knew this was a controversial decision, and he never officially received the sisters. He simply allowed them the time they needed to mourn with their sister Mary. Despite the kindness extended to her, the war made it hard for Emily to confide in Mary during her darkest hour. Emily wrote in her diary, "Sister and I cannot open our hearts to each other as freely as we would like. This frightful war comes between us." That war would come between them again when it was time for Emily and Martha to leave D.C. and return home. Emily was allowed to return to Kentucky, while the president had to issue a special pass to Martha to allow her to cross enemy lines and return home to Selma. When a local reporter learned President Lincoln issued a pass to his Confederate sister-in-law, controversy erupted. Papers shared the news and criticized Lincoln for using his position to help a Confederate sympathizer. And papers published rumors that Martha had used the trip to the White House to smuggle contraband goods home to Alabama. That allegation was proven false. The Todd family would remain divided throughout the war. They were forever haunted by it and the loss they endured because of it. In March 1865, Martha Todd White sought help from her brother-in-law. She wrote a letter to Lincoln requesting a permit to move thousands of bales of cotton to sale. Martha was now estranged from her sister Mary, which speaks to how desperate she must have been to write that letter and ask for her brother-in-law's help. There was an acknowledgement of receipt from the president, but the permit was never granted. 1 month later, President Lincoln was assassinated, and any hope of reconciliation was shattered. Martha died 3 years later. Historian Stephen Barry wrote the following of the complicated final chapter between the president and his sister-in-law Emily Todd Helm, who had been welcomed into the White House when she was grieving the loss of her husband. The Southern sister, closest to Lincoln, was the last to pour hate into the spaces love had filled. In late 1864, she wrote a blistering letter to Lincoln, blaming him for all her family's misery. Her husband and 2 brothers lay buried in graves, some of them in places she had never heard of, and she was threatened with becoming a brotherless, fatherless, husbandless mother of 3. The man who had made her so was the commander-in-chief of the Union Army, her own brother-in-law, and perhaps most painfully, the only man left who could help her. What could she do with such grief except to lay it at his door? And when shortly after she managed to send this letter, she learned that Lincoln himself had been assassinated, what could she do with those feelings but write to his son Robert to ask if he needed her to come to comfort him? When the war ended in 1865, Elliday and Martha considered themselves lucky to have their husbands home. Nathaniel Dawson completed his commission with Magnolia Cadets in April 1862 and had returned home to marry Elliday in Selma. Dawson continued to serve the Confederacy when he was elected to the state legislature in 1863 and again saw military action when he commanded troops on the Alabama coast in 1865. The flag Elliday and Martha created for the Magnolia Cadets was used for the last time at Harper's Ferry in June 1861. It was then turned over to company officials. When Nathaniel Dawson returned to Selma in the spring of 1862, he brought the flag home. It was inherited by his son Henry, who donated it to the Alabama Department of Archives and History in 1903. After the war, Elliday served on the Ladies Memorial Association, which raised funds to erect a Confederate monument in Live Oak Cemetery. When Elliday died on November 14, 1877, she was laid to rest in Live Oak Cemetery. Nathaniel was devastated by the loss of Elliday, who was just 37 years old when she passed away. He ordered a sculpture of his wife from Italy, but when it arrived, he was disappointed with her hair and sent the statue back to Italy to be reworked to perfection. It was returned and erected in Live Oak Cemetery. The inscription reads, "To the memory of his wife, her husband dedicates this monument, thankful for his happiness, sorrowing for his loss, hoping steadfastly through God's mercy to meet her when the night is past in the perfect and unending day." When Nathaniel Dawson died in 1895, at the age of 65, he was buried next to Elliday in Live Oak Cemetery. Their final request is a reminder of the eternal division between President Lincoln and his rebel relatives. Elliday and Nathaniel requested that they should be buried in sight of the Confederate monument as their tribute to Southern valor. Southern Mysteries is created and hosted by me, Shannon Ballard. If you're interested in reading more about the Todd family and their very complicated relationship, I highly recommend Stephen Barry's House of Abraham, Lincoln and the Todds, A Family Divided by War. You can find a link in the list of sources here in the show notes or at southernmysteries.com. If you're enjoying Southern Mysteries, you can help others discover this independent podcast by rating and reviewing the show where you're listening. If you want to dive deeper into Southern Mysteries, you can hear the archive of the first 3 seasons and Southern Mysteries shorts when you join me on Patreon. Your support allows me to cover the cost of researching and hosting the show, which is done by me with no support staff. And in return, you get access to content that isn't available anywhere else. Plus, you can support at a level which gives you access to my monthly Audacious podcast, which features stories of some of the most shocking and scandalous cases in American history. If you have the Patreon app, just open it up and search for Southern Mysteries Podcast to learn more and support my work, or you can head straight to patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. However you choose to support the show, just know it is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for listening.